very much, David. And you all have a gem right here in your community. David Swanson is one of the hardest working people for peace that I've ever seen. And he's done endless things and running one of the most prolific websites that if you want to know what's going on in the world every single day, then going to what's now called War as a Crime is the first stop that I make every day to see what's been going on throughout the world. So, David, thank you very much, and for organizing this on not too much of a notice. So it's really, I'm very appreciative of the fact that so many of you all came out tonight, and it's a real credit to the organizing, you know, that you know the levers to pull to try to get people out on things, and it sounds like newspaper ads seem to be the thing for right now. That's really good. Well, before I start on my talk, which is Iraqing Iran, I do want to comment on some of the people that have been up here. I am just thrilled that Garrett and Grant and your cousin are bringing this lawsuit on behalf of all of us against our government, one of the greatest polluters in all of the world, to try to stop this endless pollution of our environment. And I'm going to see if I can't hang in there in Washington until Friday, because I want to be there. I want to see our government on trial. I mean, we get put on trial all the time, don't we? I mean, we're protesting wars and things like that, and I want to see our government try to respond to this beautiful lawsuit that you have created. So thank you all. Let's give another round of applause. And to David and Dee Dee as representatives of your city council. I mean, you all ought to be proud, aren't you? That your city council. It says that the United States should not be going around invading and occupying all these countries, and the next one on the list really is Iran. So for you all to have had the courage to stand up as elected officials, you know, we don't have too many elected officials who will stand up against governmental abuse of power. And to have your own city council members go ahead and say to the Obama administration, as we had been saying back under the Bush administration, when the Bush administration was making all those noises about it's time to go ahead and attack Iraq because of a reported nuclear weapons program, or a nuclear weapons program that we suspicion they may be embarking on. And now, how many years has that suspicion been going on? Long time, lots of suspicions. And being led down the primrose path by our government, that government that I was a part of for so many years. I mean, I was 29 years in the U.S. military, 13 years on active duty, 16 in the reserves. I retired as a colonel back in 1996. Then I was in the U.S. government as a U.S. diplomat and was in there for 16 years. And David kind of gave the listing of all the countries that I served in as a U.S. diplomat. And many of them in crisis, some of them in crisis because of what the United States had done and its policies. And in fact, I had served in Afghanistan. I had helped reopen that embassy in December of 2001 and stayed there until April of 2002. As David mentioned, I was on Democracy Now! Yesterday morning, and they had asked me to come on. I happened to be up in New York participating in the May Day parades and all. And so I ran into Amy Goodman out on the streets over at Union Square, and she said, "Oh, did you hear that President Obama is in Afghanistan right now?" I was like, "No, I haven't heard." I hadn't looked at my cell phone in at least an hour, and in that hour, all of a sudden, there was news coming in that Obama had flown to Afghanistan to sign the strategic partnership that the United States is going to be having with Afghanistan for the next 10 years. A strategic partnership that we don't know too much about yet. And a military partnership, an economic partnership. that will involve, gosh, we don't know what, a residual force of 5,000, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000, 30,000 U.S. troops. The president did say we'll not have any permanent bases in Afghanistan, but we seem to have bases permanently planned out right now. I mean, we have major mega bases in Afghanistan. In fact, one of the mega bases was attacked 6 hours after the president made this public announcement in the middle of the night in Afghanistan. The middle of the night. Now that shows you how secure that place is. That after 10 years of the United States having invaded and occupied Afghanistan because of, let's see, what was that? That was because Al-Qaeda was there. And Al-Qaeda back in 2000, 2001, and cooked up the plans to do the 9/11 stuff. So we went into Afghanistan to go after them, and while we're going after them, let's take out the Taliban, because it was the Taliban that let Al-Qaeda use Afghanistan as a training place. So for 10 years, 10.5 years, we've now been in Afghanistan, spent billions of dollars there, trained, equipped, retrained and equipped hundreds of thousands of Afghans to be a part of the national police and the national military of Afghanistan. And yet the President of the United States cannot fly into the country in the daylight because it's too unsecure, too insecure. And in fact, 6 hours after he flew out of there, there were attacks by the Taliban on a major installation in Afghanistan, in Kabul, where he was, showing purposely, the Taliban hearing on international press that, oh, the president is in here right now, we better get something together and show him that we can do anything we want to in Kabul. And indeed they did. 6 hours later, they mounted an attack on what's called the Green Compound, and for 3.5 hours, they blew that place up. 11 people were killed, if I got the numbers right on that one. At any time of the day or night, they can mount attacks in Kabul, Afghanistan. I was there 2 years ago in the little guest house that we stayed in. 6 weeks after we left, the Taliban overran it and killed all of the UN employees who had then moved into that guest house. Killed them and burned the whole place down. 2 months after that, a guest house that was about 2 blocks away, right in the heart of downtown Kabul, where some aid workers from the country of India were staying. The Taliban overran that, burned it to the ground. The major hotels in Kabul have bomb shelters, where all the international guests will start running as the rockets and mortars start coming in. And this is nothing that we really hear about every day, but every single day there are things that are happening in Afghanistan, in Kabul, and in the major cities of Afghanistan. So that was, let's see, 10 years ago, I was in Afghanistan as a government employee. And then less than a year later, a year and 3 months later, I ended up resigning from the government. I ended up resigning on the decision of the Bush administration to invade and occupy an oil-rich Arab Muslim country that had not done anything to the United States, had not had anything to do with 9/11, but the Bush administration was saying they have weapons of mass destruction. Those weapons of mass destruction that on behalf of the world, behalf of the security of the world, we've got to take down that Saddam Hussein regime. Well, gosh, I remember, that what was it, 12 years before, no, 20 years before that. When was Gulf War I? 1991, 92. So that would have been 10 years, about 14 years before. The United States and a coalition of the willing had gone into Kuwait to push out Saddam Hussein, who had invaded and occupied an oil-rich Arab Muslim country. And the world was aghast at that, aghast. And over a period of months, the international community debated whether or not there should be a UN resolution authorizing military use of force to go in and push Saddam Hussein out. And indeed, at a certain point, the UN Security Council voted that yes, military operations should take place then. It was kind of laid out. We knew what had happened there. Well, during that 12-year period, after Saddam was pushed back into Iraq, we know that the international community put a blockade around Iraq for the next 12 years, a blockade. Only things that the international community wanted to allow go in and out could go in and out. Mostly medicine, but not a lot of medicine. There was 2 no-fly zones over Iraq. Over 400,000 Air Force sorties were flown over Iraq during that period of time, essentially knocking out all of the military structures and most of a good portion of the civil infrastructure of Iraq. So I was thinking, here it is 12 years later, we've had these no-fly zones, we've had this place in a quarantine. I mean, the quarantine was so tight that even our Secretary of State at the time, Madeleine Albright, you know, when she was asked, there were a lot of young kids that seemed to be dying in Iraq. You know, they say 500,000 young children had died of malnutrition or lack of medicines. And our Secretary of State, when she was asked, is that quarantine worth it? And she said, yes, it is. It's worth it. And those were just the casualties of war. She has a new book out, and apparently on the talk circuit now, she's saying, maybe I could have said that a little differently. Well, you could have said it differently, and you could also lobby to say, it's not the kids that should be suffering under these things. In fact, blockades and sanction programs are horrific, horrific. They never hit the people that are in charge of policies that our government says are bad policies. I mean, we see that in Iran right now. A huge, huge group of sanctions that is really putting, well, from the government's perspective, it's a lot of pressure on the people that really need to have it, those government officials. But we know for a fact it's not the government that's suffering under it. And we should learn a lesson from what happened about Iraq, where George Bush, Colin Powell, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld mounted you'd have to say, kind of a masterful public relations or psychological operations program on the United States people with the cooperation of our compliant media, that anything they said was reported on as actual truth. And then some of the reporters themselves, Judith Miller of the New York Times, of course, being one of the proponents of writing inaccurate, let's just say, lying articles in the New York Times about that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Well, I was in Mongolia at the time. I was the deputy chief of mission in Mongolia, and I was hearing all of this kind of from afar, kind of like way from afar, all the way out in Mongolia. And it was like, well, you know, this doesn't sound right. They're just something that, you know, the feeling you get in the pit of your stomach when you know that they're just, something's not right. And it wasn't like we diplomats around the world were getting any extra information. We were reading the same newspaper articles you all were. We were getting directives from the State Department saying, here is the press release we're going to be putting out today about the weapons of mass destruction. Please take this to your government, the government you're accredited to, and see if you can get it in the newspapers of the country you're accredited to. And it was like, well, none of this explains anything. And then Colin Powell made his long address to the UN Security Council in May of 2003 about those weapons of mass destruction. And, well, that really worked. And how many of you all saw that? I mean, it was probably one of the most watched 2.5-hour presentations ever in the history of the world. The UN Security Council was listening. The UN General Assembly was listening about, here is the evidence of those weapons of mass destruction. And so what did the UN Security Council do? It voted for war. No, it didn't. Nobody was convinced of it. In fact, 2 times the Bush administration pleaded with the UN Security Council to authorize international military operations. And the UN Security Council said, we don't believe you. But did that stop the Bush administration? No. They went ahead and invaded and occupied Iraq illegally, without the authorization of the UN Security Council, and without, even though they were trying to say there is an imminent threat, an imminent danger to the world because of these weapons of mass destruction, except the world was saying, we don't believe you. But that didn't stop them, and I ended up resigning on March 19th, which was